Hi, everyone. It's Laura Taylor, Curator of Interpretation at the National Museum of Toys and Miniatures, and I'm joined here by our Curator of Collections, Amy McCune. And today we're going to be talking about new acquisitions. We're going to spend the first part of the program just kind of talking about our process and how we collect and why we collect the things that we collect and what goes into that. And then we're going to look at a few of the new acquisitions in the last couple of years. Unfortunately, we can't show you everything because we don't have that much time, but we're going to show you a few of the ones that we think are just really cool and have a great story. Down below, there's a Q&A button there. So we'd love to hear your questions and comments. So please feel free to add them there below. And Amy, my partner and my good friend here, is the Curator of Collections, and I'm the Curator of Interpretation. So the way that we sort of divide that up, we have a lot of crossover duties, but I'm kind of work with the people and she works with the collections. But we're both very interested in each other's work. And so, Amy, tell us a little bit about being the Curator of Collections. What is your job? What do you do?
So a curatorial job in all museums really is very individualized to that museum. And so the Curator of Collections position, as we define it at the National Museum of Toys and Miniatures, means that I'm responsible primarily for the care of the collection, and the registrar and the collections manager both work in my department. And then we also manage kind of the tracking the collection and making sure that everything is in the database. And then the other part of my job is the one that I share with you, to curate exhibitions. Because I have that primary responsibility for the collections, I'm the person that deals with all potential donations. I'm the first stop.
Mm-hmm. And just a little bit of background, before we renovated the museum in 2015, we spent we were cataloging for a long time, but we spent about 2 years really concentrating on the cataloging of the collection. And at the point that we closed for renovation, we had 72,000 objects in the collection. And where are we about where are we now?
I think we're at about 87,000 objects.
Mm-hmm. So
we very actively collect.
Yes, yes. So we have a collecting period. And do you want to talk about that period and why we do it that way?
Sure, we collect between November 1st and April 30th every year. So that's 6 months of the year. And the reason that we do that is that it's a very labor-intensive process to talk to all donors, do the research that's necessary, schedule the meeting, and we can talk a little bit about that process. And so the 6 months that we're not collecting gives us the opportunity to get other work done. During that 6-month period, we'll hear from an average of 125 potential donors, which, if you think about it, is a lot of contacts in a given month.
Mm-hmm. And that's a lot different than what you've experienced at some other museums in your prior to this in your career.
It is, and it's primarily, donations are primarily of toys. And if you think about it, who doesn't want their toys to be in a museum collection? They're very precious to us, and we want them to be preserved and share them. And so donating them to a museum is some people's first idea.
Mm-hmm. And we get this a lot about donating versus purchasing. And we receive a lot of donations as opposed to purchasing.
The vast majority of the collection has come in through donation.
Mm-hmm.
Pretty limited purchase funds. And so purchasing really only happens, it almost never happens that someone comes to us and says, I have this thing that I'd like to sell to you. and that it's something that we want to the point that we would spend the limited purchase funds we have. It's more often that we'll see something that we've been looking for that really fills a gap in the collection. And at that point, then we'll work toward purchasing that object.
Mhm. Could you talk a little bit about the scope of our collection?
Sure. So of course we have two different collections. We have the toy collection and the miniature collection. The toy collection really, when the museum was first started, it really focused on about 1870 to about 1930. So it really was kind of Victorian toys. But we've tried to bring the collection much more current. We don't collect much that's less than 30 years old, because that gives us an idea of whether it's a toy that kind of passes the test of time. That's not always true. We did collect some STEM related toys for our STEM exhibit. We basically we don't do preschool toys and we don't do recreational toys. Those are the two kind of big categories that we don't include. But everything else is a potential for the collection. And what we're trying to do is really get a very broad scope of the kinds of things that were part of our daily lives, really from the mid-19th century through the 20th century and into the 21st.
Mm-hmm.
Miniature collection is fine scale miniatures, and mostly what we collect is art that is produced by the artists who are involved in the International Guild of Miniature Artisans. And if they're not involved with IGMA, then they work at that level.
Mm-hmm.
And everything that we collect for the fine scale miniature collection is to scale. So one of the things that people don't always understand about our collection is something that was made for a dollhouse, but isn't necessarily to scale, is in our toy collection.
Mm-hmm.
It might be a similar size to a miniature. It might be very similar to a miniature. It's going to be part of the toy collection because it was made for that audience. It was made to be played with, as opposed to a piece of art that the fine scale miniatures are.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have anything to add to that, Laura, about the collections?
Yeah, I think that with the especially with the fact that we're moving through the 20th century now, we're looking at things that are 30 years behind us. These are mass-produced toys, and so there's a lot of them. The way they've been cared for, there's a pretty broad spectrum, and so that has been an interesting challenge to navigate. And one of the things that we really look for is a good story with those toys. Mm-hmm. So something that, expresses the children's creativity with the toys, something that might be a common experience that other people can identify with, like, how you played with your Power Ranger toys or something like that. So looking for something that sort of, there may be a ton of them out there, and we're not really looking for the best specimen. We're looking for the one that tells us about its importance to kids at that period of time. So their story about it is really important to us. So that's probably one thing that I would add. And with the miniatures, I think that one of the trickiest things about miniatures, and I think that this is something that is very much a part of our collection, is that there has to be some sort of cultural recognition or cultural importance to the object that the person is making. So we don't generally, it's kind of not particularly scenes of everyday life. I would say it has some sort of cultural importance. So that's probably what I would add to that. Yeah.
Yeah, and if I could build on that a little bit in terms of the toys, if we're approached by somebody and they have a collection, and I can give you a great example, collection of Britain's figures. If it's an adult that formed that collection, it's probably not very likely that it would be accepted for the collection. We do have other Britain's figures in the collection, and it's not going to have that story. But a couple years ago, we were offered a collection of Britons that was formed by a man when he was a child between the ages of 8 and 12. And then he talked to us about his thought process in terms of acquiring those figures, and we can share stories about that with our visitors. So that's a big difference. And because we can't really take, I mean, we have a collection, we can't really take whole collections. And even with that, we didn't take his whole collection. We took representative samples.
Mm-hmm. Yes. I think that sometimes it's hard to imagine the type of resources it takes to care for something that's really little. What's the process when it comes into the collection, and what kind of resources are involved in caring for the collection?
I'm going to back up a little bit and talk about the donation process and then follow up with that. So for the donation process, usually either I am contacted or Colleen Carver, our collections manager, and we gather all the information from the donor. We do research to see if it's similar to something we have in the collection, if it's something that fills a gap in the collection. We look at the condition of it and determine whether we think we can adequately take care of it and preserve it. And then when we agree, and Laura also weighs in on this part of the process, when we agree it's something that, yes, we would like to advocate for this to be added to the collection, then we have a collections committee, and this is a board and community-based committee. And we present to them what we're interested in acquiring for the collection, and they actually are responsible for the formal approval of anything coming into the collection. And part of the reason we do that is what Laura talked about. It's difficult to preserve objects, and it's not inexpensive to take care of them. So we have to, when we accept something for the collection, we accession it, which is a formal process to transfer ownership. And this is mostly just paperwork. And then we have to catalog every object. So if you remember back to the 72,000 to 87,000 objects, that's 15,000 objects that have been acquired that all needed to be cataloged. And we have a collections database. We use Past Perfect, which is generally for small museums, and we're a small museum with a large collection. So Past Perfect does work for us, but we're one of the larger collections that's on that database. But we record things like the description, the condition. We'll do research to try to find the date that something was made, the maker of it, and then any of that provenance information that we've been able to gather from the donor is put into the database. And that way, when Laura or I start to think about an exhibit that we're curating, that information is available to us in the database. We also have a fairly extensive research area on our network that you, Laura, actually created. And that's where, for example, miniature artists, we have a file for every miniature artist, and anything that we have research-wise on that artist is actually, not only do we have it hard copy, but we also have it electronically on our network. So that's available. So once we put it into the database, we have to, everything gets a number when it comes into the collection, and that number has to be attached to it. With miniatures, it's a little bit different than most museum collections. In most museum collections, you try to physically number every object. With miniatures, that's pretty much impossible. So what we do is we will bag objects and we'll tag objects so that we know what is what. And also we have good photography that we do and put that in the database so we can always confirm with photography. And then we have to come up with a good way to store what's come into the collection. We have, most of our collection is actually stored off-site. When the museum closed in 2014, I think it was about 80 to 90% of the collection was on display before the renovation. And now it's about 20% of the collection. So that's a big difference. So we have a large part of the collection that we have to store. There are good parts and bad parts to that. One of the good parts is that a lot of things that are in museum collections are very sensitive to exposure to light, for example. And if you put something on exhibit for 5 years, it's going to be affected by that light. So by having a larger collection and only having 20% on display, we can actually bring things out of storage and put other things back in storage and rest things. And so we get things ready for storage and we send them to storage. But now, if you think about it, we have offsite storage. So every time we want to do an exhibit, our collections manager has to go to our offsite storage and she has to bring things back because most of the things are not in-house.
And I'm always amazed at how much, you know, there's the boxing of objects, and some of those things are easy to box up. And but then the collections manager does a lot of, like, you know, creating custom storage for more difficult objects to store, to make sure that there's no pressure put on delicate parts of them and that sort of thing, which is always so impressive to me.
Right. Well, and you also have, if you have a toy and you have its box that came with it, the box and the toy might not actually be stored together because that's not necessarily going to preserve them in the best way possible. And so we have to make sure that our numbering is really good so that we can associate those two pieces later, but we will store them separately. Or, for example, if you think about a dollhouse, and dollhouses is the largest single category of toys that we have in our collection, you also have all the furnishings. And you have the dollhouse, which probably isn't going to be in a box. It's going to be on a shelf, but it might need some kind of mount. Occasionally they do to support them. But then all the contents of that dollhouse have to be in usually several boxes. And those are organized again by material. Materials are being stored together.
Yeah, and I was involved in the first round of cataloging that we did, and cataloging a dollhouse is like taking all the stuff in your own house and trying to, you know, photograph it and make a record of it, and you know, some of the little drawers have objects in them, and it's quite an intensive experience. And the reason why we have over 80,000 objects is because each of those dollhouses is like a little household. Full of objects.
Right.
Yeah. I wanted to ask a little bit about what are some of the challenges that you've faced? You've talked about, you know, putting, you know, the light, but what are some of the other challenges? And I'm actually thinking about some of our modern toys that are made primarily out of plastic.
Right. Plastics is a great example. Not everything that is made is really made to be preserved forever. And so there are objects that, plastics is a great example. There are objects that are going to change over time. Even if you have them in storage and you're taking care of them, the nature of that object of the material is that it's going to change. And so our biggest challenge is to try to preserve everything in our collection so that it's available for our visitors now, but also our visitors' children and grandchildren. So that's a big challenge. Space is another huge challenge. I mentioned that we have offsite storage. We don't have a lot of space in the museum for collection storage, or even to store things like our exhibit cases and exhibit walls, those kinds of things. So we're always wanting additional space. And actually, when we consider if something's going to be added to the collection, we actually have to consider what the cost will be of preserving that object in perpetuity, because we can't preserve everything.
Right.
That's one of the other challenges, that when you say challenges, I immediately think about the fact that I have to say no to so many people. And it's very difficult because these are precious objects. And really, it's not that they're not of value. they just don't fit with our collection, or either the scope of our collection, or we don't think we can take care of them, or we have 2 or 3 of the same thing already in the collection. So that's pretty difficult, and people are usually very gracious about it. And I try to give ideas for other places, but there aren't a lot of other places, aren't a lot of other museums that collect in the same areas where we collect.
Mhm.
And so that's kind of a challenge.
Mhm. We have a question. Does the museum have any focus on regionally sourced toys, like regionally manufactured or played within the Kansas City, Missouri, or Midwest area? And what's the percentage that are regionally sourced?
Ooh, I don't think I can answer that last question. I just don't have that figure. I'm not going to look that up. But we are very interested in toys that have a local provenance, toys that were either made or played with in Kansas City. And because of where we're located, we do get a larger percentage of things offered from the region. And that's good for us too, because then it's fairly easy to get the objects to the museum. When we're offered a donation and it's far away, then we have to figure out how to safely transport it between the donor's home and the museum.
Mm-hmm.
I would say though that we're not, I don't know if I would call it a regional focus, in that if something comes in and has a really great story, but it's from somewhere that's in another part of the country, 1,000 miles away, we're still interested in it because it has that great story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'd like to go ahead and look at some of our more recent acquisitions. And while Amy pulls that up, I'll talk a little bit about we have acquired, like Amy said, about 15,000 objects in the last few years. And so we can't talk about everything, but we picked out a few that we wanted to tell the stories of. And this first one is Barbie Magical Mansion from 1991. And it belonged to the little girl pictured here, Keisha Clay. And this dollhouse was a Christmas gift. She asked Santa for it. And, her mom told her, Santa has to buy for a lot of kids. And this is a pretty expensive one. It cost over $400 at the time. So a really big purchase. And so Keisha, came downstairs on Christmas morning and struck her signature pose and said, Santa brought me the dollhouse. And she played with it for most of her childhood and into her tweens. And it was just something that was really, really special. Her stepdad built a special case for it to be stored in, and they had hoped to pass it along to Keisha's children, but unfortunately she passed away as a young woman. But this was not a toy that was produced for a long time because it was so expensive. And it is the Magical Mansion because it had a lot of real house features. The light, you could turn on the lights, the table lamps worked, the fireplace had batteries, and you could have a crackling fire, and just all sorts of little details about this house. So in the spectrum of Barbie dream houses, this one was a really big deal. And here we have a picture of Keisha on Christmas morning, and she's playing with the washer and dryer there, but you can see one of the side tables with the table lamp there behind her. One of the things that I love about Keisha's story, Keisha was a Barbie girl. She loved Barbie. She collected Barbie, everything Barbie. Her room was decorated around the dollhouse. She had a collection of Barbie Christmas ornaments. And she was all about, as an adult, fashion. She was high energy, high fashion, her mom said. But she also was very aware that it was a privilege to have such a dollhouse. It was something that she questioned a lot, like how was I privileged to have this dollhouse? And really, the dollhouse gave her a sense of empowerment, to believe in herself. But also she really was interested in service and how to give other kids opportunities that she had. So that led her to do a lot of work with children at the Boys and Girls Club, at Church of the Resurrection, and that was something that she was really interested in. And she and her mother actually started a business where they did tea parties for little girls, so that everyone would get a chance to have a magical tea party. So I love this story because the dollhouse was such an empowering thing for her. And we're also very excited because this is the first dollhouse to come into the collection that belonged to a little girl of color. And this is actually going on display here in the next few weeks. So you'll be able to visit the museum and see this in our long-term exhibit, Let's Play House in the Modern Dollhouse case. And I was trying to think about this. Do we have another Barbie dream house in a Barbie house other than the very first one, Amy, in the collection? I don't think so.
I don't think, we have the very first dream house, but I can't think of another house that we have. We have the fashion shop, so we have another
structure.
And I should say that I see the slide, this very first slide has an error, and I apologize for that. This Magical Mansion was actually only made 1990 to 91. So that 65 to 70 was obviously something from a cut and paste that I
yeah,
did not correct.
Well, and I also wanted to point out the first Barbie dream house that we have on in the collection, it's on display in the iconic toy hallway, was a studio apartment made out of cardboard. So I think it's so interesting that Barbie's expectations really changed over time, but so did the expectations of little girls like Keisha as well. So I love that we're going to have both of these dollhouses on display, and there'll be an opportunity to compare and contrast them.
Yeah, it's a great story. Thanks for sharing it, Laura.
Yeah. So this acquisition came in a couple of years ago, I believe. And this is a doghouse and a transport van. And it was built by A.G. Higgins for his grandson. And then the dogs that you see, these are all sorts of different dogs, different makers that were collected by the grandfather for the grandson. And maybe did the grandson also collect too, Amy?
Collect the dogs. I think they did dogs over time. And they're all different, they're all different scales.
They're all different scales, they're different materials. And then the doghouse and the transport van was passed along to a neighbor for their children. And then they packed it away, and unfortunately not all of the dogs survived. So the dogs that you see here, there's 2 China ones, and then the rest are wood.
I think there's some composition as well.
Composition, and then I think a couple that are made out of metal too.
Mm-hmm.
So unfortunately, the rest of the porcelain ones did not survive. But I just, when I saw this, I was so charmed by it. It's so unusual. It's homemade. It's one of a kind. There's no other out there. I love that it's both the doghouse and the transport, like sort of the kennel and the transport. So if you want to take your dogs out on a outing, you can do that. But just really adorable. And who doesn't, Kansas City is such a dog town, everybody loves dogs here. So I just really love this. Is there anything you wanted to add, Amy?
No, I think that's a good synopsis of it. It's a,
Yeah.
I guess the only thing I would add is it's a little bit smaller than it seems, than it appears in the photo. It's, I didn't look at the dimensions, but it's probably about 2 feet across. And in the photo, it looks much bigger to me.
Yeah, what it reminds me of is the 19th century Noah's Arks.
Mhm.
The toys that, you know, a lot of times were produced in Germany by families, and that's kind of what it reminds me of, is an old Noah's Ark with um, the transom flap that
Mhm.
so that you can get inside. So that's what it reminds me of.
Yeah, that's great.
And Amy, this one was of particular interest to you because of the exhibit that you just curated.
It was. So this actually was, just came in a couple months ago. And when we were working on developing Bridging the Gender Divide Toys That Build STEM Skills, we were looking for exactly this kind of toy, a toy that would help a child develop spatial skills is one thing that the Technibricks toys would have helped develop. And this came in from a man who played with it actually in the mid 60s, but it actually dates much earlier. It's from about 1935. But he played with it, and his daughter played with it for a middle school project that she had in about 2000. So it's actually had a longer life, which is kind of nice. One of the things the donor said, which I loved, was that he built the architecturally correct buildings using Elmer's glue, and that the cool thing is you could disassemble your building by simply placing it in a bucket of warm water. This would dissolve the glue, then you just rinse the blocks off, let them dry for a week, and then build a different design. And he also said that he really liked this toy, probably why he became a mechanical engineer. So that was, whenever I hear of evidence that toys actually did have some influence on someone choosing a career in STEM, it is a really great moment for me, because that's of course what the focus is of the STEM.
And these look like they're wood, but they're not, are they?
I think some of them are wood, yes.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
The templates on the right, and it's a little bit hard to see them, but they are basically just that, templates to help you build the building. And this was interesting too, because they marketed this, that you could buy the Technibricks and you could design your own building and show it to an architect who could then create the design so that it could be built
Mm-hmm.
as an actual building. So I thought that was an interesting approach that the company took toward marketing their toy.
Yeah. I love it when toys also had like an adult application, you
Mhm.
know, like using the I'm blanking on the name of it. The optical toys that you collect, Amy.
Viewmaster?
Viewmaster, using the Viewmaster during World War II to be able to train people on how to spot plane silhouettes and that sort of thing. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. I'll
This
talk about this one.
Oh, this one is one of my favorites. So the dollhouse below, actually, we've had for quite some time. It was a dollhouse that was built for a little girl named Jean Clark Perry, and her dad based this on the design of her maternal grandparents' house. So it had a familial inspiration. And then her mother did the interior of it. And the most recent acquisition the family sent us was this little scroll saw, which is here on the left top, which Amy and I had quite a time putting together. So if any of you are scroll saws aficionados, we're sorry if we did it wrong. But this is the little scroll saw that Jean's mother used to create the interior of the house. And like the lower left-hand room, I don't know whether you could tell this, it's all paneled with a wood from a cigar box. It's got this beautiful staircase. It's just a really lovely dollhouse. And then of course, over on the right-hand side, there's this beautiful garden, which is an unusual feature for a child's dollhouse. So this dollhouse, if you attended our Space of Our Own dollhouse exhibit in 2019, you saw this dollhouse, and the family recently sent us the scroll saw that they used, that was used to create it. So it makes a nice complement to the rest of the objects that we acquired. And actually, I wanted to mention this dollhouse is so, it's very labor intensive to set up because there's over 400 objects in it. And everything is so perfect and so delicate. It's mind-boggling that a child played with it.
And I will say, we did struggle a little putting the scroll saw together, but the donor actually sent us a 6-step process with photographs of each step. So that was really helpful to be able to put it together. But at the end, Laura said, "We don't have to take this apart again, do we?" And I said, "No, I think we can store this together."
I know, it kind of made me want to have a scroll saw. I was like, what could I do with this? Now that I put it together, I feel so confident. Yeah.
Yeah, it's hard to tell, but this blade, I'll use my cursor, the blade goes from here to here, and it is so thin and delicate. And that was one of the things that concerned us. We wanted to make sure that we didn't break anything as we together.
Oh, I wanted to also mention, like, this is such a detailed dollhouse that Jean's mother was actually featured in newspapers for having done this beautiful dollhouse. And it has a lot of the dollhouse furniture is commercially made. Like there's arcade pieces in the kitchen, and there's all sorts of, commercially made dollhouse furniture that you can recognize. But it appears, that she may have even had that furniture ahead of time and worked out her dimensions based on the furniture, which I think is really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to let Amy talk about this one, but this is great too.
So this is a set that came in just in the last collecting period, so just a couple of months ago. And it's really interesting in that when I first saw it, I saw the horse and the rider, and I thought, well, is that actually something that somebody played with, or is it just something that they bought and displayed? But then I started talking to the donor, and the reason I include these other pictures is that she has a very rich story of playing with this whole set. It was 3 horses and 3 riders and 3 dogs. But you can see on the left these grooming tools. And I don't know if you can tell, but this is a bottle cap. And this is a toothbrush. So basically, as part of playing with this set, she and her friends made the grooming tools. And this one even has a little box that was the grooming kit. Every horse had a name, and every rider had a name. She got the first one, the black horse, this one, in about 1958 or 59. And she got these. These were not inexpensive toys. We have a photocopy of an ad from FAO Schwartz in 1967. So they were still selling the horses at that point. But she would get 1 horse at a time, or a horse and a rider. And so built this collection over several years. And she thinks she played with it from about the age of 7 to about 12 or 13 years old. But she was a real horse person, and I believe still is. So for a long time, she actually had these in a stable before she gave them to us. And so this was kind of an early part of her lifelong love of horses.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll talk about this one too. So this is by a real friend of a gift from a friend of the museum, Jack Britton. And this was a toy that belonged to his father. And it's called the Flips and Flops Flying Clowns. And if you can imagine this little handle, you would pull that down and this clown would fly up in the air, flip around and land on the other part of this wire right here. And then they would actually, it would turn so that, and both clowns were on it. We haven't actually had it do that because it would be a little dangerous to have museum collection objects flying up into the air. But we did kind of simulate it when we did the professional photography, which was kind of fun. This was actually designed by Orville Wright, and it says patent applied for on it, but we knew it probably was a pre-patent toy because when Jack donated it to us, he said it was from about 1918, and the patent actually was granted in 1925. So this is a very early version of it too, and you can see it's in really good condition. But I imagine it did get played with and that the clowns probably flew around and didn't always land exactly where they were.
Mhm.
Laura, do you want to talk about this one?
Yes. So the bear that you can see on the upper right in the palm of the hand is a little bear that a woman named Karen found in an antique store. So it's an antique bear. And she was just so charmed by it. She went back and it was still there, so she purchased it. And she just began to imagine his personality. And he went around with her in her pocket quite a bit. And eventually she acquired this antique child's dollhouse and began to furnish the dollhouse for Ted, the teddy bear. And then wrote this book about Ted called Little Ted. And then in the lower right-hand corner, we have Ted's train car as well, which was produced by Play School in the 1930s. So with this acquisition, we have the antique bear, the dollhouse, the story, the train car, and then we also acquired Ted's wife, Ted's wedding album, Ted's wedding invitation, and Ted's children and Ted's vacation photos. So we have the whole entire story of Ted the bear and his adventures and his loved ones here. And we hope to display this sometime next year. But just a really lovely collection of objects that are quite old, but have been put together into a really lovely story about Ted the bear. Yeah.
And an interesting feature of this donation is that the donor has actually given us the rights to the story, which she wrote. So we'll be publishing that, maybe serialized, or I think we're still developing the plan, but that's a very cool part of the donation as well. And I know when it first came in, we had some trouble kind of getting our heads around the whole collection. And she actually, the donor lives not close to Kansas City, and she sent us some of the materials so we could view them in person, not the dollhouse, but some of the written materials, so that, and the photo albums, so we would have a better idea of what we were acquiring for the collection.
Mm-hmm. Very sweet, just a very sweet story. Yeah. And I think that that's one of the things about, you know, these are very old toys, but they have this ability to continue to delight us into adulthood.
Absolutely. We're going to switch gears a little bit and go to miniatures.
Yes.
So this was actually the first commission that Laura and I did. If you're familiar with Barbara Marshall, the co-founder who started the miniature collection, one of the things that artists would tell you about her is that she would ask them what they had always wanted to make. And then when they would tell her, she would say, okay, you make that and I'll buy it. And sometimes she waited a really long time. I think there was one object she waited 14 years to receive from the time she agreed to the commission. So this bed rug was actually something that this artist, Pat Hartman, had come to Miniature Masterworks in 2017, which we hosted at the museum. And she had a bed rug that she had entered into the competition. And we did not acquire the bed rug at that time, but it had made such an impression. And so we kept thinking about it. And a couple years ago, we were at the Tom Bishop show in Chicago. And I asked Pat how many bed rugs she had made. And she said, just that one. And I'll never make another one. And I'm sure my face fell. Laura was there too. And I'm sure she was reacting in a similar way. So we kept talking to her and we visited her booth probably 3 times over the course of the weekend. And she started to think about, well, if I did make another one, what would I do? And she liked the idea of this one having a dark background because the other one had a light background. So by the end of the weekend, she was like, I think I will consider doing that for you. So we got back to the museum and she sent us photos. But one of the things she said as she sent the photos is, I really love this one. And so we thought, well, isn't it appropriate to commission a piece in the spirit of Barbara Marshall to do something that the artist really wants to do? So she worked on it for several months. And in fact, we commissioned it in 2019 and we received it in 2020. She had other projects at the same time and some shows that she went to, but it was a very labor intensive process and a beautiful result. I should say too, it's based on a bed rug from 1803 that was made in New Hampshire. Bed rugs were really a New England tradition to have this very thick and heavy covering for a bed. And they were basically 18th and very early 19th century pieces. So this is right in the perfect time period for bed.
And I wanted to mention that we have a case in the gallery that is going to be a rotating case that highlights textile work. And for me, after working with this collection for so long, I just have such tremendous respect for the textile artists. I think that textiles are one of the hardest things to work with in miniature because, you know, you want them to drape and do the things that make them look like they're full scale, and that requires quite a bit of skill. So this will be going on display, I believe, next week. Coming up.
Within the next 2 weeks, it will be on display.
If you get a chance to come over and see it, the picture is lovely, but in person, it's just so vibrant.
Yeah, it's stunning.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk about this one, Laura?
Sure. So this was a donation by artist Leanne Chellis Wessel, and we had originally, we wanted to commission this during Miniature Masterworks, and she eventually made it and donated it to us. But this is a replica of the Jazz Bowl by Victor Schreckengost, and Victor Schreckengost was a famous ceramicist, but also an industrial designer. And if you look up Schreckengost, it's just amazing all of the different things he had a part of, you know, from toys to lawn furniture. He just designed all sorts of different things, and actually went into the military during World War II and designed things during that period of time for the military. So just a really amazing, talented, incredible artist. But this Jazz Bowl, the original one, the full-scale one, was commissioned by Eleanor Roosevelt in honor of when her husband became the governor of New York, I believe. And so she commissioned this beautiful, vibrant Jazz Bowl. And Shrek and Ghost eventually did this in several different colors, and so has Leanne. So she's made miniatures in several different colors, but we have the original color, the turquoise, which is just stunning and beautiful. And I think it's a little bit hard to tell, but here, this picture, this bigger picture on the left, it's actually in my hand. So it's just so tiny, and when you turn it, it just has, you know, all of these different scenes on it. And you just really have to look so closely to really get the full effect of it. And I'm not sure when it's going to go on display, but I hope we're going to be able to do something where you're going to be able to see it in the round, because it's really amazing. Yeah.
So the next two slides represent really kind of an interesting and exciting method of acquisition for me. They're basically rugs by two different textile artists, Barbara Cosgrove and Shirley Greenberg, who are both deceased, and the donations are from their children. And so it really is a great honor for us, I think, that their children thought that some of their mother's rugs should go into the museum collection. I will say that both artists had work already in the collection that Barbara Marshall had acquired. So, you know, they were kind of, we sometimes will acquire from artists that Barbara Marshall didn't acquire something from. Usually it's an artist who was not working at the time that she was collecting, or an artist maybe that was very early in his or her career. And so we try to kind of bring it up to current day, but stay consistent with the way that, with her eye and the way she collected. So in both cases, we had, I believe, one rug in the collection by each artist, and we got between 8 and 10 from each of these artists, from their children. And this is interesting. They also are about 20, I think 25 years apart in when they were made. But they were about the same age, interestingly enough. Barbara Cosgrove was working very early in the 1970s making these rugs, and Shirley Greenberg's are from the late 1990s. She was making them before that, but the examples that we acquired were from that time period.
And I'm going to jump in and say, when Amy says working early, you know, our fine scale miniature collection really dates from the 1970s to the present. And the 1970s are that period of time where there's this big explosion of interest in miniatures, and that's when the fine scale miniature art movement starts. Right.
So I'm going to quickly jump to the other slide so you can see them both. So these are the examples by Shirley Greenberg.
Mm-hmm.
I see that it's about 5 till 3. So
yeah.
We have 2 more slides.
Okay, we'll get through them. And if anybody has any questions, we'll try to answer any questions too.
So this is actually, these are 3 examples of a miniature collection that we received from the family of Bud Copel, who was a longtime volunteer of the museum. And he was very interested in collecting miniatures made by Native Americans. And so it had a fairly extensive collection. And I'll let Laura talk a little bit more about Bud, because she had a long association with him through the museum. But one of the things that's exciting to me is that we're going to be updating the gallery that we've always called our Southwest Gallery. We are turning into the Native Peoples Gallery, because it really has always had artwork from tribal groups beyond the American Southwest. But we expect to be able to put these miniatures and several more from Bud's collection into the new gallery.
And
Do you want to say anything about Bud?
yeah, just a little bit about Bud. Bud started Bud started volunteering at the museum before the museum opened. So he volunteered at the museum for a very long time, and he and his wife, Jan, both volunteered, and he was an architect here in Kansas City, and he and Jan ran a Christmas miniatures business on the side where they did these absolutely stunning little miniature Christmas trees, all decorated with tiny little paper chains and ornaments and the whole 9 yards. So they were very interested in miniatures. They especially loved Christmas miniatures, but this Native American collection, art collection, he always said that he wanted the museum to have, and it's something that he worked on very diligently, even in the last few years of his life. And he passed away about a year and a half ago, and he was in his 90s, and had continued to volunteer with us. So some of you may have run across him in programs. He often masterminded a lot of our educational programs, like miniature Easter egg dioramas, and that one we did with breakfast eggs that he saved over time from his breakfast. So he was just a thoroughly delightful miniature enthusiast, and we're so honored to have his collection.
Absolutely.
All right.
Laura, I'll let you talk about this.
Yeah, this is the Falcon by Mego Corporation. And the Falcon was the first African-American superhero in mainstream comic books. So the Mego Corporation produced this line of action figures from lots of different comic book companies, and licensed them. But this is the only comic book character of color that this line produced, that Mego produced for their collection. We're so excited to have him. He's actually already out on display in the iconic toy hallways with all of his superhero friends. And so when you visit, you're able to come in and see him right away. And he's so handsome. Yeah. All righty. Well, we are almost at time. And as you can see, Amy and I could talk about this all day long. It's just one of the joys for us is collecting and finding wonderful things for the collection. I wish we could talk about all of them because, you know, it's really great stuff. People often ask us, do you play with the toys or the miniatures when no one is around? And honestly, we don't play with them like kids, but this is a form of play. There's this joy in collecting that is the legacy of our two founders, Mary Harris Francis and Barbara Marshall, and the legacy of friendship. And it's so nice to work with Amy because we do have a really good time. And we're going to go ahead. Oh, it looks like we've got one last question. From Carolyn. She says, thank you so much. Wonderful presentation, so informative. Thank you so much, Carolyn. We hope that you'll join us again for some other presentations here in the future. And this is being recorded, so it'll be up on our YouTube channel if you want to share it or watch it again. All right. Thanks so much, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you for joining us.